Any church might rescind a potential call after hearing me sing in Bible study. That was brutal. Yeah, I know. You know how they say the video adds 10 pounds? Well, the audio distorts it by about 3 keys. So if you start out of key, it's going to end even worse. Make sure you have a worksheet like this for Ruth chapter 3. If you had to describe one of the most loyal acts someone has ever done for you, could you think of something like that? What is the ultimate loyalty you have ever been shown? You think of anything? Aside from Christ, of course, but humanly speaking. Okay, but an example. Phil? Marriage? Okay, good. Marriage would be a great example. Okay, for most of the guys, the fact that your wife has stayed with you for all these years is a miracle of God's unconditional love, right? What's that? You guys want to meet again at my office at about 1:30? Let me get some lunch and then we'll talk. What else? Loyalty. Remarkable acts of loyalty that you've witnessed or that you've experienced. Boy, you guys have all suffered heartbreak and disloyal relational difficulties, huh? Okay, Jen Heine. Jen Heine's loyalty to the ministry here, she was really day one. Day one. Wow. You got the what? Okay. So Jen Heine she's now the last woman standing from the very beginning, 2006 or 7? 2007. So 17 years of preschool ministry. Jen has been here every year, almost every day. Wow. That is remarkable. So marriage and ministry, we've got 2 examples. What's one more? Anybody got one? Tanya. Okay. Sticking with a job. Maybe do you have a personal example of it, or in spite of all the hardship you guys have experienced, you've stayed with Sky High? No comment, Jason? Okay. Yeah, I mean, think of how many people you've talked to. My father-in-law might be an example who stuck with GM well over 30 years, before retiring. Many of you might have stayed with a company for a long, long time, maybe even longer than that. It's remarkable loyalty and dedication. Today we're going to see some remarkable examples of loyalty between Ruth and Naomi and Ruth, and Boaz and Ruth and Naomi. So let's get into chapter 3. Someone ready and willing to read Ruth chapter 3, verse 1 through 6 on the front side of your sheet and also on the screen. You got it. Okay, thank you. refer back to Ruth chapter 1, verse 9, which says, "May the Lord grant," Naomi talking to Ruth and Orpah, "may the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." So Naomi was realistic about the low percentages that Ruth might have for finding, Ruth and Orpah, for finding rest, shelter, peace, comfort, stability in life, unless they went back to their home country. And you remember at that time, Ruth said, "Where you go, I go." Right? And so now here, at the beginning of chapter 3, what does Naomi refer back to again? What was she mindful of? Yeah, she didn't forget about that priority just because Orpah had gone and Ruth had come. She still realized we need some long-term stability here, and the word for home is really like a rest, a shelter. What practical application of wisdom and love did Naomi demonstrate by doing that? See 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5, and chapter 5, verse 4. So let's chase those rabbits. New Testament, Paul's letter to a young pastor named Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 5 says, "If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church?" What was Naomi considerate of when it came to Ruth? Yeah, her familial well-being. This is a biblical principle, not just a pastoral one. Now, how about 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 4? "If a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God." Well, Naomi was prioritizing the well-being of family here, and then Ruth reciprocated, didn't she? So that's the practical application of wisdom and love that Naomi was demonstrating, and of course, Ruth showed it in return too. Now, Naomi says a few things here that might be perceived as suggestive. Let's talk about it. How might we understand Naomi's directions for Ruth's prep and attire? Okay, yeah, she wanted her to look nice, but why? Okay, so he'd be attracted to her. Why else? You're right, but say more. So that he might be interested in more than just attraction, but perhaps even commitment, like marriage, okay? Can you think of a negative way, a negative light people might put this verse into? Who was Ruth by background? She was a Moabite. And what were the Moabite women famous for? Yeah, so there is some suggestion here that, which we think is false. I mean, we think this was a godly directive. But there are some who would cast aspersions on Naomi and suggest that she was telling Ruth to be a little suggestive here. But how can you understand it rightly, not just in terms of commitment and marriage, but otherwise? Exactly. Yeah, clean up. It's the end of the harvest, It's the end of the harvest, so, kind of put your face on and go make this appeal. Because even if he didn't take Ruth's hand, he still might be willing to buy the property, like he was able to do as a kinsman, right? Number 4, why would it be good to visit Boaz after he ate and drank? For this, let's refer back to Genesis chapter 27. We're not going to read that whole chapter, but we'll just note that is where Jacob and Esau went for the blessing. But in order to get the blessing, what did they do to Jacob? Or excuse me, what did they do to Isaac first? Prepped a big meal. Yeah. I don't know if I can theologically say too much about it other than like a celebratory occasion and a joyful mindset from which to share a specific blessing. So this is not uncommon. Why might it also be good to visit Boaz after he ate and drank? Yeah, good spirits, relaxed, yeah. Number 5, what did it mean for Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet and lie down? Actually, should I have said lay down, babe? I think I should have. Yeah, 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 correct. And so you know, the way that the language bears out in the book of Ruth, if you want to talk about a consummation of a relationship in Hebrew, the verb is yada. Yada means literally, that's, and so the literal English rendering of it would be, you get to know her. Getting to know her is yadaing, okay? That verb is never used in the book of Ruth, which is important because there is a propriety with these relationships that is bearing out, which is part of the reason why we can be so sure that Naomi's suggestion wasn't, over the line, nor was Ruth's conduct Rahab-like suggestive, say. Okay? There was decorum and propriety with the way that she presented herself to Ruth. There was dignity to it, okay? In what ways did Naomi's proposal involve risk? Obviously a marital pun there because it ended up being something along those lines, but in what ways did Naomi's proposal involve risk? She didn't know the degree to which Boaz was actually interested in her or was just being loyal and frankly generous to her. There was the family dynamic, there was the Moabite dynamic, there was the master-servant dynamic. So there's a lot of things sort of in play here that create uncertainty. In what ways or way did Naomi's proposal not, oh, by the way, number 6, in what ways did it also involve risk? We'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but Boaz was sort of like, a boss man. The boss man might not normally have slept on the threshing floor even after the harvest, but for what reasons? Protect the crop. Yeah, he didn't want anybody to take it. But why else? Because all the boys who are done working might be tempted to also party a little bit after the crop and the harvest is finished. And you might bring in illicit people or prostitutes for that occasion. You eat and drink and you're in good spirits and you want to celebrate the long harvest work being done. And so you carouse a little bit, right? And so Naomi's proposal is, hey, get gussied up and go down to the threshing floor late at night. It's like, well, there could be a little bit of theoretic awkwardness there. Didn't turn out that way because, in part, Boaz's dignity and watching over the crop and the workers, too. He managed his affairs with dignity, and so when Ruth presented herself, her dignified presentation, along with the way that Boaz was managing his affairs, aligned well under God's gracious plan. Well, he did, but she was coming under the cloak of darkness. They didn't even know she was there. Yeah, so that didn't apply necessarily here. In what ways did Naomi's proposal not involve risk? Pardon me? Okay, yeah, she has nothing to lose. Okay. What's the worst he could say? No? They had the kinsman-redeemer relationship, which was already revealed in chapter 2, right? So we know that he's a kinsman-redeemer. He's a goel, and therefore there's an opportunity here. Okay? Yeah, he's already demonstrated his character and strength, and the strength of his character. And so Naomi knows that even if her idea isn't warmly received by Boaz, it's not like he's going to, uh, harshly reject it or dismiss it. He'll, thanks but no thanks is the worst that could happen. All right, let's get to chapter 3, verses 7 through 15 now. It's actually a pretty short chapter, but anybody willing to take those verses, please? If you want to, go ahead. Thank you. We kind of covered this already, but why did Boaz sleep on or about the threshing floor? Well, for the stewardship of his crop, but also of his workers too, very likely. Number 9, why did Boaz have to ask who Ruth was? Okay, he was sleeping and he had just been stirred, absolutely, but why else? Okay, she cleaned up, but there's something very important lacking from that era. Electricity, yeah. It was dark, and they were on the threshing floor, probably outside or maybe in a shelter. Maybe in a shelter. So it's dark. You don't know. It's clearly a female because you can smell and see her. But just to make sure, I want to clarify. And and it was dark. So it's just a practical thing. Who are you? And again, you're stirred from slumber, so you want to make sure. Number 10, Ruth's response was actually very, very remarkable on 2 levels. So it's a hard question, but the way that you can best answer it is by thinking about what we talked about the very first question, chapter 3, verse 1. Why was Ruth's response to Boaz so remarkable? Okay. Okay. you're thinking good thoughts and getting on the right track. As a Moabite, she had to make sure to clearly identify some things and to kind of break the ice, but towards what end? Her own. I am your servant Ruth, spread the corner of your garment over me, which is what who had directed her to do? Naomi. And that's in chapter 3, verse 1. But since you are a guardian redeemer of our family, which Naomi had not directed her to necessarily go there. So Ruth kind of sort of like went beyond what Naomi had directed her to do for the sake of Naomi. She was not just concerned about the shelter over her head or her future with Boaz, but also her mother-in-law, which was pretty remarkable because she could have just angled for herself here and we'll figure out Naomi's thing later, but right now, first things first, me and Boaz, she was stewarding the blessings and the opportunity that the Lord had given to her, but on not just for her own sake, but for Naomi's sake. So, great question. So Amber asked about the kinsman redeemer. We kind of covered that last week, but just to review, kinsman redeemer did three things. You remember? What was one? Okay, to redeem the property of a relative in the event of a situation like this where the next of kin or the heir had died. So that was a kinsman redeemer's property. What was another one? A goel, remember? Okay, another thing that a kinsman redeemer would do is not just to redeem the property in the event of carrying on the family's estate, but to carry on the family's name by taking the wife of a brother who might have died. And you got to remember that this might have been common in the event of disease or military. Okay, and so the Lord wanted to see after not only the property of a family, the inheritance, but also the name of the family too. Correct. Or in the family, yeah. So Naomi's husband had died, and then Naomi had two sons who also died, and then the two daughters-in-law didn't have a rightful claim unless there was a redeemer. But lastly, there was one more thing a goel could do, which is not related to this context necessarily. But a goel was also responsible for vindicating or for carrying out justice in the event of a murder or wrongful killing. And just FYI, Amber, last week, because I thought this was a nice, just a meaningful way to think about Jesus, because we think of Jesus as our kinsman redeemer, our brother who took upon us as his family in order to redeem us. But Jesus essentially earned our inheritance, preserves our names, and enacts righteous justice on our behalf. So Jesus is the ultimate, true and better kinsman redeemer, if you will. Okay, number 11. Boaz complimented Ruth's kindness in verse 10. There's actually a richer way to understand it, and that is as loyalty. Her loyalty. There is a richer meaning of the word than just, an act of kindness, because what she's doing is demonstrating not only loyalty to Boaz as the goel, knowingly, and an older man, clearly, but a loyalty to her family, especially to her mother-in-law, and to the word and to the will of God. There is like a multifaceted dimension to her loyalty that includes not just Boaz, but Naomi and the Lord, which is really, really wonderful. I guess I should have, let's see. I was just thinking of the spread your garment over me comment. Let's see. We've already gone past it, but there's a connection between the words that Ruth uses in inviting Boaz to spread his garment over her that tie back to chapter 2, where Boaz compliments Ruth on having come to him under the careful sort of like garment spreading over or wing covering of God. I can't remember the exact verse here. Let me go back and look. Ruth chapter 2. There's just a lot of poetry to the narrative is all. So you can see a lot of connections intertwined here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, thank you. Under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And now here she is taking refuge, or asking Boaz to take her under his refuge. All right, Boaz makes it clear he was interested in Ruth. Okay, thank you, Captain Obvious, but let's spell it out. How so? Yeah. He accepted her invitation, but okay, so here's another kind of cool story. And I didn't read the People's Bible for today, but if any of you have, maybe it makes mention of this or it doesn't. But in the Hebrew language, after Ruth in verse 9 says, "Who are you? I'm your servant Ruth." He asks, "Who are you?" And Ruth says, "I'm your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." Up until this point, Boaz has been very dignified, very statesmanlike, and what we would call, in a good light, very, very smooth. Okay? He's a smooth operator in a very, again, dignified way. And then he gets woken up in the middle of the night, and Ruth identifies herself, and he kind of fumbles and bumbles his way through. He trips over his tongue. Okay? Now we're able to make sense of it translationally, but it's kind of like, if I could make maybe an imperfect analogy to it, my wife and I met on Match.com, and I saw her pictures on Match.com and everything, and you make initial contact, and by the way, incidentally, I said, I was trying to be very dignified and keep it very slow, and she emails me back and she's like, "Yeah, that's great. When can we meet?" And I'm like, "Wow, okay. So spread your garment over me, huh?" Yes, please. No. But so we go out to a place called Boston's Pizza on Hall Road, M59 in Macomb Township, Michigan. And she walks in the door and I'm like, you don't know. I mean, you become a fool. You can't even think of what to say, and everything you say is so clumsy or self-conscious. I mean, you lose it. You know what I mean? I think that's comparable to what happened here with Boaz. He's like, you wake up in the middle of the night and here this young woman is at your feet, and she's saying, in a dignified way, "Can we figure this situation out for loyalty between each other, God, my family, my mother-in-law?" And Boaz is kind of tripping over himself to articulate an answer. You can understand this playful sort of fumbling, can't you? And that's exactly what's going on here. So with that, Boaz makes it clear that he's interested, but the way that he pursues it is very, very godly. It's the middle of the night. The workers are actually resting. It's dark. No one would have known if they fast forwarded a little bit. But he did not. He did not take advantage of her. He did not cross the line. He even upheld the word and the will of God by saying, "I am interested, but there is someone who's a closer kinsman than me," which Ruth had not known. So he was honest. There was integrity here in the relationship. And so, loyalty being one of the themes of this chapter, Boaz demonstrates loyalty here to the word and to the will of God, not just to his workers or to, the sixth commandment or to Ruth, but God first. This is a great example of letting your light shine in the darkness. So number 13, the question, how did they pursue it? Well, how did they pursue it? Quietly and, again, with prudence. He wanted to make sure that nothing happened to her reputation. So she laid at his feet until morning, but he got up before anyone could be recognized and said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. You told us not to do it, and now here you are doing it?" Correct. So guarding her reputation, guarding his own, guarding the standard protocol and not wanting anybody to think this was an exception, he gracefully allows her to exit. And by the way, what does he give her as she does? Yeah, we don't actually know how much it was, in part because the Hebrew literally says he poured into it 6. That's it. That's what we mean by kind of like stumbling, bumbling here with the language. So we have to guess what Ruth left with. And it's hard to know because she's just one woman. How much could she, especially in darkness, cart back to her mother-in-law at that time of day without making much sound or without it overloading her? God bless you. So we think it was a maximum of 50 pounds, like 8 gallons-ish. Yeah. We don't know because a bushel, I mean, there's different ways of measuring and knowing what the quantity was, but it seems like it was a more modest amount than she got the first time. And partly because of the time of day, the noise, the weight. So, well, there's a reason why it says 6 measures and not say 6 ephahs, because we just don't know. But it couldn't have been 6 ephahs because she wouldn't have been able to physically handle it. No, I mean, very few would have been able to. So we think that the maximum amount he probably loaded her up with would have been about 50 pounds. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. What did we say an ephah was last week? A gallon and a half? Is that what we said? Right, and even like 50 pounds in your shawl? Yeah, but that's what they say. Well, yeah. But without knowing, I think you got to be very careful to think that the shawls would have been exactly like today either. Yeah, yeah. Well, it depends on, I mean, we have blankets at home that could probably hold quite a bit of weight in a bundle, depending on, how she wore it, a lot of things. So, but again, and like we say, we're saying kind of a maximum about 50 pounds. It might have been a little lighter, but it was clearly more than generous by Naomi's reaction, which is coming up. Let's read the last 3 verses. Go ahead if you got it. Okay, thank you, Brad. I'm going to, since I stumbled and bumbled my way over the amount. Oh, yeah. Okay, there's a couple more things I'm going to highlight. First of all, the weight here. So just to carry on here, Boaz invited Ruth to stay on the threshing floor until the morning. There's a careful choice of words here. Boaz could have invited her to lie down or to sleep there until morning, but the verbs to lie and to sleep can refer to sexual relations. So instead, Boaz invites her to lodge, which, although an unusual verb in this context, removes any ambiguity and makes it clear that he has no hidden agenda. Okay? And by the way, it's also interesting because Naomi wants her to find rest, shelter, by going to Boaz. And so he, poetically almost, with regard to the narrative, provides her lodging. Okay. He provided Ruth with 6 measures of grain to take to Naomi. Since the size of the measure is not given, there is considerable speculation, which is what I was trying to convey. We can't possibly know. I don't think we could. It says, it is generally agreed that the measure could not refer to an ephah, since an ephah refers, 6 ephahs would equate to over 500 pounds. Yeah, so obviously too heavy to carry. According to the Targum, the measure was a seah, S-E-A-H, which is 1/3 of an ephah. That explains that Ruth was given some strength and power before the Lord to enable her to carry such a load. Another possibility is that the measure in this context is an omer, which is 1/10 of an ephah. This would have weighed about 50 pounds and was less than Ruth had gleaned during her first day in Boaz's field. Okay? Nevertheless, even that would have been a substantial load to carry, especially early in the morning. Okay? And we might add to his commentary with a shawl. At any rate, since Boaz has to help Ruth to lift the grain, a considerable amount is implied. And the emphasis is on his generosity, which I think we kind of highlighted here. Okay? So he helped saddle her up with the omer, probably, about 50 pounds, and make her way back to Naomi. All right, another thing just to highlight from the last section, I maybe had Brad read a little too early, but in verse 11, notice that Boaz says, all the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Now, look back at chapter 2, verse 1. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of noble character, standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. In English, it's not translated the same way, but it's the same word that's used. So the same man of dignity and integrity, that is, of strength and noble character, virtue, the same word that's used there to describe Boaz is now poetically in the narrative used by Boaz to describe Ruth. Isn't that pretty cool? So there's a deeper connection here than just, oh, you two make such a cute couple. There's more to it than that, isn't there? Okay, now to the section Brad just read, verses 16 through 18. There's an interesting question that Naomi asks Ruth. She returns, and we understand why. In English it says, well, how'd it go, my daughter? But literally what Ruth is asked by Naomi is, who are you, my daughter? Who are you? Now, what would that imply? What would that question imply? Yeah, has your status changed? Right? Who are you now? Are you still Ruth the Moabitess, widow? Or did Boaz say yes? And now you are, exactly. So knowing that actual translation can be a little bit helpful because, again, it would have all been very, very smooth for them conversationally and culturally, but for us, some of those little nuances are hard to pick out. And Naomi was basically like a eager mother-in-law, kind of hoping for more, And Ruth responds that she told her everything that Boaz had done for her, but then she adds something, just like she added to Boaz from the directions that Naomi had given her earlier. she added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" So in other words, Naomi, she gives Boaz the credit for the loyalty that she, with Boaz, was trying to show Naomi. She gave Boaz the credit for that loyalty, not herself. Very, very selfless response by Ruth. She didn't say, "It went great. We're gonna figure this out. He's eager to do it. We got to take care of the other potential closer kin first. And I didn't forget about you. I asked him if he'd give us, something to take care of you too." There was no I involved. Pardon me? I mean, not always. She was a sinner, okay? Ruth is not, but you're absolutely right. In this account, what we know about her is that she was incredibly humble and loyal and loved her neighbors even more than she loved herself, or as she loved herself, in the occasions we're seeing here. Ruth clued us into additional information. What had Boaz done? Well, he had looked after them, but let's look at chapter 1, verse 21. Naomi, in her roller coaster ride of faith, when she's discussing the potential parting between her and her daughters-in-law, she says, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Call me Mara," right? "The Lord has made my life very bitter. He has afflicted me." Well, again, poetically, she had gone away she had gone away to Moab during the famine full with her husband and her sons and her extended family. She had returned to Bethlehem, the house of bread, in her perception empty, only to be filled to overflowing again by the Lord through Boaz. So there's just a lot of little poetic bookends in this story that are really, really beautiful. And perhaps that's really what I was getting at with that number 16, life is full of little ironies, so also is the Bible. I'll just say without her permission, so my wife, before we met, was looking for a more Christian relationship. How about a pastor? Be careful what you get. Be careful what you ask for. You just might get it. So, isn't it so poetic if you look back on your life sometimes? What you thought was lacking not only is provided, but provided even more fully than you could have ever predicted. That's the generosity that the Lord provides for us. Now, that's not to say everything will be a white picket fence and hunky-dory and rainbows and butterflies, right? But the Lord's hand is careful, caring, thorough, overly generous. Anybody else have an example of that you can share? Indeed. Catherine, for those watching at home, brought up the book of Job. How the Lord had given, then taken away, then given even more than what he had had before. Anybody else have a personal example they can share? Yeah. 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 Indeed, the Lord provided you, so you had a great career, but after the accident, you found equal, if not even more fulfillment in the new station in life that the Lord led you to, which is, and how beautiful too that it could be so meaningfully family-centered. Oh. Hmm. That is amazing, yeah. Hmm. Yeah, so a complete life alteration. Hmm. So you could actually live on less, but be more filled up after, because of what the Lord allowed. Hmm. Love it. Anybody else? Anybody else? Any questions or comments on Ruth chapter 3 or John chapter 6, the bread of life? Here's one, since we got a couple minutes yet before the kids get out. Help me understand why John chapter 6, the bread of life chapter, is such a beautiful metaphor of Christ, but one that does not refer to the Lord's Supper necessarily. It might recall for us after the fact the Lord's Supper, but why wouldn't we understand John chapter 6 as a metaphorical Lord's Supper chapter? Yeah, yeah. A little bit, yeah, especially because eating the bread of life in John chapter 6 only and always leads to what? Eternal life. But you can actually take the Lord's Supper to your eternal judgment, to take it in the wrong way. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 11, right? Some eat it and drink it to their judgment. That's a great starting point. There's some more to it. Why else do we take John chapter 6 as bread of life? Eating the bread of life, eating equates to faith, just simply believing that the body and blood of Christ in life and death and resurrection has earned for us eternity. Why else do we understand John chapter 6 as simply a wonderful and enriching metaphor on faith and eternity rather than on the Lord's Supper? I mentioned one earlier, for those of you who are here. Jesus didn't institute the Lord's Supper until over a year later, so it would have been understandably baffling for him to be conveying this metaphor to people who didn't even know about something that hadn't been instituted yet. So that the timing doesn't match up. Why else? Is it okay now for you, when you're reading John chapter 6, to think about faith, but also the connection and the importance of the Lord's Supper to your faith? Oh, certainly. And certainly we do eat and drink Jesus' body and blood now in his miraculous presence in the Lord's Supper. But it's not for, and it is also for the sustaining of our Christian faith until we go to heaven, right? So, good. Well, thank you. That's all I had for you. It's a rare occasion where we're going to get out before the kiddos. So, let's close with the blessing. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you. Amen. Next week, we will wrap up Ruth chapter 3. I think we might get into Proverbs in September. Is that what's next on the list? I think we're going to go through the first 10 chapters of Proverbs, I think. But I'll double check that and get back to you. Right. Yeah, another good metaphor, right? He's it's not the same metaphor, it's a different one, but it's similarly metaphorical, right? Uh, I was talking to the Gutzmers earlier and to Margaret and saying, maybe I'll have to revise my sermon a little bit, because I had a line in there about how the seminary president had said, just eat and everything else can wait, right? But I could say, diabetically speaking, humanly speaking, in a low blood sugar moment, theoretically, I could have not eaten and still lived eternally. But spiritually speaking, you cannot live without eating, without believing. So, and that's kind of the similar point in John chapter 4. You must drink from the well of Christ in order to have eternal life forever. You can revisit a well and get dehydrated and stuff and still live another day, but you can't get to heaven without drinking from the well of Christ. All right. God bless your week.